do want to say a word of thanks as well to all of you and just the church in general. I think I mentioned this before, there's around 45 to 50 people involved in this drive-through. And in a time that we've all went through as a community where, you know, this COVID has shut down a lot of things, I'm thankful that we still have a lot of people in the church that are very willing to help in whatever way they can, and that the church is willing to try and reach the community in this way, in the best way that we know how anyway right now. So I'm thankful for that. And you know, there's some blessings of having that. A lot of churches are struggling just to have Sunday service, and we've been, you know, Wednesday night, Sunday night, Sunday morning, and I'm thankful we've been able to do that. A lot of fellowship happens when we walk in the door here. Even though we're distanced and we have masks on, it's still a time that we don't always get to have, and some people are really missing that. So I'm thankful that we're able to be together, and things like what we're going to do this weekend are able to occur, and I appreciate your faithfulness in that as well. If you would look in your Bible to Luke chapter 15. We're going to really focus on verses 25 through 32, which is the last part of that chapter. But I want to back up to verse 11. We're going to read all of the parable of the prodigal son. I think it's an important thing for us to note here, the groups or individuals that are represented by the characters of this parable. And I believe we talked about it a little bit last week, but in every crowd that Christ had in front of him, typically we could say that there was about three groups that would be there. One was the people that were trying to arrest him in some way. One was the group that had believed in him. The other was a group that was just kind of intrigued by him. In this parable, he kind of breaks it into two different groups. There's the group that are what we might term religious leaders, or the Pharisees of that day. And they are represented by the older son. And then there's somewhat everyone else. And they're represented by the younger son. And then you have the father that represents God. So as we think about that in this aspect, as we look at the interactions between the individuals, I want you to remember the representations of who these are, because it really brings into light God's love, even though he had disagreements with the Pharisees. It really brings into light his love even for them, and his desire to try and get them to believe in him so that they could be right with God the Father as well. So keep that in mind. Let's start reading in verse 11 of our text, and then again we're going to focus verse 25 through 32. Luke chapter 15, those where we will be. Verse 11 says, "And he said, there was a man who had two sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs." And something we have not talked about, and this parable does not necessarily allude to it, but just thinking about the custom of that day, as he would have got his inheritance, it would not have been uncommon for him to have inherited some servants of his father's as well. We're not told that he did, but I want you to think for a moment if he did, and those servants went with him, because it said he gathered all that he had and went. When we think about sin and how far it takes us in life, we have to realize that sin not only takes us, but when we head down that road, it usually takes some others with us. If he had servants that he inherited, then he would have taken them with him. And as he went and he spent everything he had, he would have also endangered those servants and put them in a place where they did not have what they needed to care for their own life either. Which meant he would have brought them into a dark place, so to speak, or a sinful way. We know that he returned. The story's about that more than it is anything else. But realize that those servants, if they were with him, did not return. When you think about that in the aspect of where sin takes us sometimes, it can lead us down a road that takes us away from God. We know sin does. And then we can take people with us. Sometimes we may return to God, but those that we took with us may not. That's the danger of all of this, is that we may have a time where we see the light, so to speak, and we come back to God, but others that we may have influenced along the way may not have, and we may not have. So there's an importance that we should have in staying true to God in all of our life, not only for our benefit, but for others as well. Look at verse 17. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread? But I perish here with hunger. I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants." And he arose and came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." And they began to celebrate. Now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing, and he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, "Your brother has come home, and your father has killed the fattened calf, because he has received him back safe and sound." But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him, but he answered his father, "Look, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command. But you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him." And he said to him, "Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found." Let's go back to verse 25 and begin kind of walking through this a little bit. Question 1 on your sheet says, assuming that the young son represented sinners, which we believe that Christ was doing with this, those who were not scribes and Pharisees. The older son represented the scribes and Pharisees. Why would the Pharisees feel pretty good about this parable up until verse 25? Yeah, really hadn't addressed them too much at this point in time. He's really dealt with the younger son, which they would have termed the sinners. That's why I put that in quotation marks. They would have termed them the sinners. And Christ is really talking more to them. So Pharisees were kind of sitting back and saying, "Hey, y'all been doing wrong." And Christ has finally realized it and talking to you about it. And then verse 25 rolls around, and there's a different feel that takes now on this conversation. Question 2, if the younger son was guilty of the sins of the flesh, what was the older son guilty of? Which of these is more noticeable, and which is harder to deal with? Now, we can obviously say the younger son is guilty of sin of the flesh. We know that prostitution was involved. We know that he went and just squandered all the inheritance that he had, that his father had given him. We know that he had a greed as well that was within him. That's why he wanted this inheritance. Thought he would be better outside or out from under his father's house. So we see all of that sin of the flesh that goes on. If he's guilty of that, and we know he is, what was the older son guilty of? Sins of the heart. We might term them spiritual sins or sins of the heart. This was more of an internal thing. The younger son, if you looked upon his life, you saw that he was living a bad life. You looked at the older son who has remained faithful to stay in his father's house. He actually makes the statement that he's never disobeyed his father. Whether he did or not, the father didn't react to that, so we don't know for sure, but he makes that statement. From outward appearance, this older son looks to be a great guy, doesn't he? He does have that holier-than-thou attitude, which shows itself after the younger brother comes back. We don't see it, at least in the parable. It's not really described prior to that moment in time, but it showed itself at that point, pretty obviously. Which of these is more noticeable, the sin of the flesh or the sin of the heart, or spiritual sin?
The
Flesh. Which is harder to deal with? The heart?
The internal.
Why is that?
You can hide it a lot easier.
You can hide it? Yeah.
You have to burn it really quickly.
Okay.
It's sort of at the deeper root of who you are.
Okay. You know, the sin of the flesh is part of the heart too, but it's an outward, it's visible by all people. That spiritual kind of inward things that we fight doesn't show itself until maybe special occasions, like Brother Delbert brought up with this holier-than-thou attitude that comes up. But what else makes it harder to deal with? There's some accountability on things that are outward. Taking the example of the younger son here, prostitution thing, if someone sees him walking in, they can hold him accountable and say, hey, you don't need to be going in there, kind of thing. But the older son, this appearance that this attitude that he's shown at the end is only visible really to his father at this point in time. So there's not as much accountability that can be held in that because it's not an outward show at all times.
And it's not always pointing it out to you. Well,
That's right.
I always felt like this was love. What Christ was talking about was love. Because when he talked about the workers, some came early and got a set price, and then some came at the end of the day and got the same price. Some of those early workers were kind of frustrated because, we've been here this whole time. We're getting the same thing. Christ said, you've been with me the whole time. You got this. You agree to this. Everything's good. They came in last. They got the same. So you should be happy. And that's what he's saying. His brother should have been happy that he came home, but he had no love. He was resentful because he got to go out and party. I didn't get to go out and party. He didn't have love for his brother to come home. And I think that's what Christ is saying. You need to not look on people with resentment, but look at people. If you see somebody that's partying all their life, and you work really hard. When they come to Christ, praise the Lord, they come to Christ.
Right.
Don't be like, I've been sitting at home saving money. You've been partying. You know what I mean?
Right.
He was saying, be love, have love.
Which goes to that holier-than-thou attitude that kind of Delbert brought up as well. There's another aspect too that sometimes, because we have a tendency to look at the outward appearance, and we make statements such as, man, they're really a great person, because we're basing it on what we see on the outside. We don't see them walking into a prostitution place or whatever. And so we make these statements that, they're a really great guy. And they may have some really good characteristics about them. And because of that, if that statement is said to the individual, they may develop, because of what they've heard us say, they may develop this attitude of, I am okay. Do I really need God if I'm okay? And so that accountability actually becomes a negative accountability because we're giving them what we might term a false hope, that they're an okay person. And that's part of what makes this internal harder to deal with. Also, we find too, if someone has been brought up in church all their life, been around it, they've learned what's the good things to do and the bad things to do. But just because they do good things and bad things doesn't mean that they're right with God. And so that internal is still hard to deal with because they have to realize that there's a need for something more than them just doing good or doing bad. That's what Christ was fighting with the Pharisees. I say fighting. That's the disagreement that he had with the Pharisees. There was a need for that broken relationship with God to be restored by Jesus Christ. It could only be restored by Christ. The Pharisees were living the good life, so to speak, and so they thought they were okay. So it is harder to deal with that, I believe, in most cases anyway. Question 3, what are some of the positive characteristics of the older brother? Now, I do want to point out, and Mike kind of alluded to it too, both brothers sinned. It wasn't that one of them did and the other one didn't. Both of them sinned. There were some positive characteristics in this older brother. There was also some positive in the younger one once he realized, his sin and came back. What was the positive characteristics from a worldly standpoint in the older brother, though? He was faithful. He stayed, worked. All appearance we have is that he was faithful to work for his father. What else? Say it again. Obedient. Self-proclaimed, and his father didn't argue it, so we're going to go with obedient. Anything else that you can think of? There was a loyalty, right? Hard working, which Daniel mentioned. He was a hard worker. He was loyal, obedient. All of those characteristics are good things to have. But none of them actually get us right with God. It's only by a humility of realizing that we can't be right with God by our own actions that get us there. And even though he expressed some really good characteristics, by the world, they would say he's a great guy. But by God's standards, he was not. Question 4, the elder brother had a problem forgiving. Who would he not forgive in this parable? He wouldn't forgive the father. Who else? The brother. It's kind of easy to see that he's not forgiving the brother because, he's really angry with him that he's come back, home. But he's also not forgiving the father. And why is he not forgiving the father? Let me just go there.
He felt like, why am I not owed this? I've been here the whole time. You've never killed the goat for me. You never threw this big party for me. He felt entitled to something that he shouldn't have been.
Entitled? Yeah.
He felt jilted by,
Guilted?
jilted.
Helping him out a little bit. There's not very many of us in here that stayed home and worked hard, and we saw our brother leave and partying up, heard all the things he's done, come back, and praise the Lord, he's back. Most of us be like, dude, I've been down here working this farm. You've been out partying. Don't be coming up here like most of us would be that way. Giving the guy some credit. But
Yeah.
I would be frustrated.
I think it describes a lot of our hearts, that internal struggle that we have anyway. Whether we show it on the outside or not, it's a description of kind of an inward thing. Now, I want to remind you, when we think about who he's not forgiving, we find that he's not forgiving his brother, but he's also not forgiving his father. Now, remember who those individuals represent. And the father represents God. The older son represents the Pharisees. The younger son represents, I'm going to say everyone that's not a Pharisee. So you have an example here of God showing them that, hey, you Pharisees are not only not forgiving the tax collectors, but you're not forgiving God either. The one that you say you're actually serving, because you're not willing to forgive them, you're also not willing to forgive the Father, which you have in no way anything to hold against him. You're actually trying to earn your way there, but you're saying he's being unfair to you. So I think it's interesting that through this, Christ is trying to show them that they are not being the individuals that they say they are being. And he's trying to show them through this explanation. Ultimately, what did the older brother or elder brother lack in his life? He had faithfulness, he had loyalty, he had hard work. What was he lacking, though? Compassion.
I think Mike's right, love.
Love. Forgiveness. Maybe mercy in there. All of those things that Christ displays and had displayed to the tax collectors, the sinners that he was sitting with, all of those things is what Christ is now trying to show these Pharisees that they are not having in their life. Right. Right. Right.
It also showed some selfishness because, in that culture, it was really not unusual for the father to distribute inheritance early. They did it quite often.
Right.
And even though he did it to the younger son, which means he only got a third because the older son would have got the double portion. So he would have gotten 2/3. There were just the two sons, and it's only two that were mentioned.
Right.
So he still had 2/3, and while his brother was gone and he was there working, his 2/3 was growing. So he really had a selfish bone too.
He did. He really did. And he may have had a question, and we don't know if this would have happened or not, but there may have been a question in his mind of, okay, now that he's back, is Dad going to split this 3 ways again? Which really would show that selfishness, showing itself.
That's what I thought a lesson was taught right there, that when we seem to forget many times when someone strays and when they come back, there's still consequences. There was consequences on the younger here. 31 tells us that right there. He says, all that I have is thine.
Right.
There wasn't going to be another split.
Well, that's true. Assuming that's what he's...
I believe that.
Yeah.
I won't believe that.
And I think he's also trying to tell him, too, that, while you're living here, everything, you've had everything. Because he complains about, you didn't even give me a goat. And the father says, well, everything I have is yours. And so maybe alluding to there's not going to be another split, or maybe just alluding to you've been benefiting from the blessing of living under my house the entire time, while he is not. And which, when we think about this from a God perspective, those who are believers in him, if they become a believer at a young age and remain faithful, even though there may not be a huge celebration, take for example someone that became a believer at the age of 10. And we make a big deal, about kids becoming believers, and we should. But someone that's, let's say, 65, and sometimes we get pretty happy about someone that's 65 that gives their life to Christ, and we should. But that 10-year-old that's now lived 55 years and has forgotten the celebration maybe that happened when he got saved, may be feeling a little bit out because he's saying, I've lived a good life all this time, and now you're throwing a big deal over the 65-year-old that has lived life to its fullest, so to speak, from an earthly term. And yet God tells us, reminds us, that from that age of 10, everything of his has been available to us. Grace, mercy, all of that available to us in our life because we gave ourselves to him at a young age. And I think there's a sense of that the Father's talking about as well here too. But it may have been too that he wasn't going to split this again, you know, and just trying to show the guy, quit worrying about, you know, this stuff. But if he was worried about it, that selfishness needed to show itself so he could deal with it. Because if that satisfied him, that selfishness was still there. And really the older son should have been willing to have split it again if he really loved and cared for his brother. Would have been against culture maybe a little bit, but he should have been willing to do that out of a love for him.
We are many times, I think probably like this older brother too, in that he apparently was kind of suspicious of his brother's repentance, of having some ulterior motive. How many times have we maybe been guilty of the same thing when someone repents who is known to be notoriously sinful? Sometimes we may think the same thing.
Especially if they've done this once before and went back into that life, and now they've come back, and maybe it's truly heartfelt, you know, but we do kind of have some suspicion about us. You know, is it really real?
The world aspect of it too, because I think everything that I deal with, stuff and say, I'm not alone. Anything that I come up with, some major things, you kind of start panicking with it, and you just think, relax, pray about it. God's going to work it out some way. Don't know how it's going to be, but it's going to be fine. You have that inner peace because you've got him with you. And this was talking about his father. You had your father with you the whole time. He's been right here. Nothing to worry about. You're right here. You're right here at home.
Yeah.
So he's not having that. He's been out in the world just living it up, having no security. Now he's back with security. And that could be a worldly aspect of this too. You know what I mean? How people focus on the world. They don't focus on heaven anymore. It seems like they just focus on today. What we can do today.
The moment right now.
The moment right now.
Yeah.
That could be that too. Brother.
And he didn't understand the Father's love. You know, just like the scribe and the Pharisee didn't understand God's love, you know, for repentance, sin. You know, this guy here, he didn't even recognize this guy as his brother anymore. You know, in verse 30, he didn't call him his brother, he says, "This thy son."
Yeah.
You know, he didn't even claim him as his brother.
It disowned him at that point. Yeah.
You know, in our Christian life, if things go smooth long enough, we kind of build complacency there and kind of build an attitude until we're reminded of something comes along that reminds us of that attitude that we're beginning to develop. I'm not sure that didn't happen to older brother right here.
There was definitely a lesson the older brother needed to learn. Whether he did or not,
Yeah, whether he did, I want to
Yeah.
think the best of it.
Of course, we got to remember, you know, this is representing that Pharisee bunch. You know,
Well, yeah.
and they had a lesson to learn. and some there, I'm going to say there's some of them that did. You know, we know that Nicodemus was a guy that seems to have got his relationship with the Lord right. We find that, you know, he was there after the death, that he participated in the burying of Christ. So he was one. We don't really hear of too many others, but there was a lesson to be learned, and it was in their hands at that point. You know, it had been, their eyes should have been opened at the end, and they had to make that decision. Question 6. In what way did the older brother respond to the actions of the father and the younger son? So what was his reaction to both the father and the younger son? Was it joy? The older brother? What was the older brother's reaction toward his father and toward his younger?
I think a lot of jealousy. I think as Christians we forget after X amount of time, you know, since you've been saved, you forget how much you were forgiven for. Because at that point you're the
Yeah.
Holy One now, you know. And I think we forget how much we're not worthy of the grace that God's given us, that we don't feel like we should pass that on for whatever reason. I'm not saying we as in us, I could just say me, I always say we, I don't know why, makes me feel better probably, but, it just, it's hard for us to remember sometimes that we were forgiven, if not more, than everybody else were forgiven.
I think there's an anger that he shows too,
Yeah.
the emotion of anger. He's mad at his father because he's taken him back. He's mad at his son, his brother, as well, and it's an emotion we have. But and this was an anger that was sinful. But does anger always have to be sinful? When is it not sinful? Well, that was an example of it. Someone said something else.
A righteous anger?
A righteous anger. And that righteous anger is when we are living for Christ, trying to stand for Christ, and it's hard to come up with an example of what this might be in our life, but we see it illustrated by Christ. We also see it illustrated by Moses. When Moses was on the mountain and the children of Israel made the golden calf, if you remember that event. He comes down off the mountain, if you remember what he was carrying, right? The 10 Commandments that God had just prescribed, and he actually drops them, breaks them, throws them down, whatever. They're broken. And God never gets on to him for that, really. But Moses is very agitated at the children of Israel. And if you remember, he grinds up the calf and makes them drink it. That was a righteous anger that Moses had because they had went against, God at that point in time. So there is a righteous anger. It says, Scripture says, "Be angry, but sin not." There are things that we should become upset over because they're going against God. How did the father treat the two boys the same? So what was his action that was the same toward both of them? He showed love toward both of them. What else did he do? Which was a sign of his love. Forgiveness. Okay. What was his physical outward action that showed that? When the younger son started coming home, what did the father do? He once he saw him, he ran to him, right? Or went and met him. What about the older son? What did the father do once he realized that the older son was angry?
He came out and talked to him.
He went out to meet both of them. I think that's interesting because God was willing, through Christ, he was willing to come down and to meet, go after, however you want to term it, those who were not trying to live the life that God called them to live. He was also willing to go after those who thought they were and yet were not. Again, the two brothers representing two different groups of people. And so we see that Christ, even though the Pharisees are trying to find something to arrest him on at this point in time, he's still willing to go out and try to seek them, bring them into a loving understanding and relationship with God the Father, even though they're trying to attack him and accusing him of eating with people that he shouldn't be eating with. So I think that's interesting to see that how far God's love goes, even when we are on the attack against him, even. Question 8, what was the older brother missing by staying outside, not enjoying the feast? He was missing the feast, obviously, the fatted calf, but what else was he missing? Fellowship with his brothers. What do we usually find through that fellowship? One word we talk about a lot that happened at Christmas. 3 letters. Joy. Look around, and this is actually goes along with question 11. Actually answers question 11. Who's the only one that did not have joy? And when you look at this whole chapter, you go back to The shepherd with the lost sheep. The one sheep veers off, wanders off, whatever. Shepherd goes after him, finds him, brings him back. What does the shepherd have? Great joy, because the one that was lost is now home. The woman who lost the coin searches frantically for it, finds it. What does she have? Great joy, right? You got the father whose son wants to go off and make his own choice decision, and he does. Comes back home, the father has great joy. The younger son has great joy. Remember that his statement was, maybe my father will let me be a servant in his house. I mean, it's paraphrased, but that's what he was basically coming back to wanting to be. He's just a servant in the father's house. And yet the father welcomes him back in, gives him the robe, the ring, throws the feast for him, whole 9 yards. There's got to be a joy in that younger son at this point. But the older son, the one that has been under his father's care, that still has an inheritance coming, and yet there's no joy in his life. He's actually angry at this point in time. Why is that? Had he looked? So he's so self-centered that he's lost all of that compassion, forgiveness, all those things that we talked about earlier, mercy, all that stuff is just not apparent in his life. And because he's not showing that to other people, there's no joy in his life. He's forgotten what his father has done for him many times. Because, let's take reality here. The son makes the statement, I've never sinned against you. How many kids have grown up and never done anything wrong? Reality is somewhere along the way, this son done something wrong. And yet the father was gracious to him and surely forgave him. He allowed him to still be his son, obviously, and kept him in the home and tells him that everything that he has is yours. So the father still treated him with compassion, but yet this son is not showing compassion to anyone else. He's not even showing compassion to his own father at this point. And because of that, there's no joy in his life. And we find that today, too. You take someone that harbors ill will against someone else. And it doesn't matter if they say they're a Christian or attend church every week, no matter what. If they're harboring some ill will towards someone, they're going to be missing joy in their life. Look at question 9, or the statement in question 9. Is it a true statement? If we are out of fellowship with God, we cannot be in fellowship with our brothers and sisters. And if we harbor an unforgiving attitude toward others, we cannot be in communion with God. Now let's take that in two separate statements, breaking it down. If we are out of fellowship with God, we cannot be in fellowship with our brothers and sisters. Is that a true statement?
Bitterness sows bitterness.
Say that again.
Bitterness sows bitterness.
Bitterness sows bitterness.
I was at the farm service the other day, and a guy that I really like him, he's a nice guy, but he's kind of bitter. And I was telling him about some stuff, and he said, man, you're too happy all the time. He said, you got to be on boat. So he told me, I said, I'm not on boat, man. I said, I just got something to live for. And I talked to him a little bit, but he's just always kind of bitter. You know what I mean? It seems like he's not got better. It seems like he gets a little bit more bitter. So bitterness sows bitterness.
Yeah.
You stay in that, it gets worse.
It's impossible. If we're out of fellowship with God, it's impossible to be in the right relationship and fellowship with our brothers and sisters. Now, we may have some friendships that coexist, but we're not going to be showing that compassion, mercy, and love toward them that God shows toward us because we're not experiencing it from God either. So we can't be in that right, perfect relationship with brothers and sisters if we're not in that right relationship with God. Second half of that, if we harbor an unforgiving attitude toward others, we cannot be in communion with God. What about that one?
Well, it goes against God's commandment to us, so we can't be in communion with him if we're not obeying him.
it's really hard to love God and hate your brother. Matter of fact, it's impossible. But yet, do we find ourselves trying that sometimes? Or let me back up from trying. Maybe that's not the best word. Do we find ourselves in that situation sometimes? Where we say we love God, but yet we find ourselves in a broken relationship with a brother or sister. If that's the case, we have to realize, and I want you to remind you, in the setting that Christ is in, he's speaking to this group of people again. Pharisees, those who are tax collectors, or the other group, both of those are what nationality? They're Jewish. Brothers and sisters. And yet the Pharisees cannot be in a right relationship with them because they're collecting taxes from us and they're giving it to the Romans. Therefore, we can't be friends with them. We can't associate with them. We can't go sit at their table and eat. We can't do anything with them because they are not living the right life.
Does there need to be anything said about the older brother's attitude and him not losing his inheritance?
Well, we don't really have the end of the story necessarily. We know that he's given a prime opportunity to get his life right at this point in time. We don't know what happens if he continues to be at odds with his father and at odds with his brother, because the parable ends at this point. We know what happened to the Pharisees if they did not, those that did not accept Jesus Christ. I don't know if we want to go any further than that or not. But we know what happens there. We also know that regardless of Pharisee or not, if we're at odds with God and we're at odds with our brother, we know what the end result of that is. And it can be an individual that never accepted Christ that could find themselves in that situation. Of course, if they never accepted Christ, they were never in right relationship with God. And if they were never in right relationship with God, they were never able to be in right relationship with man either. Could also be someone that at some point in time made a profession of faith, but yet fell away and made their choice to be at odds with God, which then made them at odds with their brother. And if that was never repented of, then they made their choice to be at odds with God. I'm not the judge, nor are any one of us sitting in here, but that's not a place I would want to find myself in. And I don't think any of you would either. So we have to keep that in mind. Question 10, I think we've kind of already answered, is the father in the story is pleading with the older brother. Who was Jesus pleading with through this story to come into the feast? Pharisees. This is one of the few places that you can really see Christ is really wanting these Pharisees, even though they're at odds with him and they're wanting to arrest him and end up getting that accomplished. This is one of the places where you can really see that Christ had came to this earth even for them and was trying and was, in the example of this, the father comes out of the feast to where they are and tries to talk some sense into him to get him to come into the feast. And we don't know where it ended up. We don't even know where this conversation ended necessarily, because the father makes the statement and then it's over. But we know that Christ's goal was to get them to come into the feast. We don't know. I mean, of course, this was individual by individual, that was the goal. Question 12 is not one that I necessarily look for an answer out of, but it is one that I believe is very valuable for us to evaluate in our own life. And that is, out of the characters in this parable of the prodigal son, which one do you identify with the most? And I think that's not even something that we can answer ourselves. I think it's something that we need to spend time in prayer with and allow God to reveal to us. And it may be, someone volunteered this morning. I didn't ask them to answer it either. Someone volunteered this morning and said, you know, there's certain aspects of each of the brothers that I can identify with in my life. Not that I want to, but I can. And maybe that may be, you know, some of where we find all of ourselves at. But there is value in us looking at this, seeing what Christ is trying to address, and then saying, okay, where do I fit into this? You know, at what point is Christ talking to me here? And I think there's value in us praying about that. And then not only praying about it and learning where it is, but then taking action about where that is. So I would encourage you to do that very thing. Any last questions or comments tonight?
Saturday morning, I was going to work. A little bit later, I was going to do some stubble rolling. And there was this, looked like a kid, like a 17-year-old kid, right there at 231, walking. And I felt like God wanted me to pick him up, so I turned around and I come back. And I said, you need to ride. He said, yeah, I need to go to the pool, over by the pool, Pocahontas. And I thought, I was from Pocahontas. I said, go ahead and jump in. And he jumped in, and he smelled like he'd been swimming in a whiskey barrel. I mean, he was saturated, you know. And he got to tell me he got to a fight. He called her his old lady, but he said, got to a fight with my old lady. He said, my brother called, and I said, we're going to go drink. We're going to run and drink. He said, I told her we was going to drink. He said, I got out. He said, drank too much. He said, I had $148 in my wallet, lost it, I don't know where it's at. He said, had a half a tank of gas in my truck. He said, I got stuck in my cousin's yard, had to get pulled out. And he said, it run out on the way home. He said, don't know where my half tank went. You know, he was going on and on. I thought, Lord, you put me here. What do you want me to say? You know? And first I thought, tell him about the sin. And I thought, no, he's a nice kid. He looked like he was 18. I mean, he's a nice kid. He's respectful. And I thought, well, I told him stories about me. I was a heathen too. I mean, I did a lot of bad stuff. I told him some stuff and how it messed up. Told him about another story, how it messed up. And how, you know, the Lord got a hold of me, got me pulled out of that junk. And I said, you know, I was losing money. I've been through this whole procedure with him. And I said, you know, you'll soon figure out that that's not the way. You know, I said, it may take a while. It took me a while. Didn't know if that was the right way or not, you know what I mean? But he listened the whole time, you know. And had a couple of those Gideon Bibles before he left. I said, I want to give you something. I said, I want you to take this and just kind of read through it. I said, it's helped me. It's got me out of the places where you're at right now, you know. And what was funny, he said he got his fist was swelling. And he said, I heard I got into a fight with my brother last night. He said, I heard I punched him right in the forehead. He said, boy, my hand hurts. And I said, well, your brother's going to be mad at you. And he said, you're really going to be mad. He said, I want to call him to see if he'll help me get my truck home. And I thought, you know. And I talked with him for a pretty good while. He accepted the Bible. And he said, can I have another one? I said, yeah, I've got another one here. He said, I'm going to give one to my sister. I said, man, I'm telling you, I've been right where you're at right now. I've done some stupid stuff. You know? I said, but this is the way to get you out of it, you know. When I left, I thought, did I do that right? You know, should I have told him this could send you to hell, or could this, you know what I mean? But I think, I hope love during that situation was better than scorn, you know what I mean? But pray for him. And then didn't even get his name. But I know where he lives. So.
Any other thoughts or?
Quick. Another lesson too that I think you can learn from this is whenever you are faithful and you've already got the Father's per se inheritance now, if you're living right, because you know you're going to go to heaven if you're living right. But He's also gave you where you're free to leave any time, and He's not going to beg you to come back. You're going to have to realize you're wrong and then come back. And then if you come back, He's going to be rejoiceful again.
Yeah. Yeah, there's that danger period, though, if we don't come back, of what happens at that point. And that's where we're not the judge, but we know that right relationship with God is extremely important at all times. And
He's not going to hold your hand and keep you from doing wrong, but you've got to want to do right to come back.
there's and we didn't talk about the younger son tonight, but in the younger son, there's, I think we mentioned it last week, that point when he realizes, I think it's verse 17. Yeah, verse 17, it says, when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? That was the beginning of his repentance. He acknowledged where he was. It wasn't the full circle of it, but it was the beginning of it. And once he started that journey home, you might could say that he was if not right at that point, he was well on his way to being. But that journey from where he left where he was to where he arrived with his father, in some ways could be compared to our life, in that we have to make that decision to turn away from the lifestyle that we're in. When we do, things don't automatically just jump to being perfect at that moment. If you remember, that young son is he's still wearing the same dirty clothes that he was before. He doesn't have the robe on. He doesn't have the ring on. He doesn't get that till he arrives at his father. But he's making that journey toward his father. He's still dealing with some dirty stuff in his life. But he's on his way there. And then when he arrives at the father, you see that acceptance and welcoming that his father has for him. And the, if you want to call it, reward that he receives is the robe and ring. But there is some thought about that journey. And that journey, he was anxious to get back to his father at that point in time. But he had realized and was willing to be a servant, not to be the brother that he was when he left, that had a prominent place, but he was willing to be a servant at that point in time, which is really where we have to be when we come to God. When we realize that we need that forgiveness, we have to be at a point where we're just willing to be a servant. We're not looking for this great thing. Now, obviously being at home in heaven with God is great. I'm not saying it's not. But that shouldn't be what motivates us to be striving to be a follower of God. It should be that we're just willing to be a servant in his house. We realize that a servant in his house is much better than being anything out in the world. And so it's kind of a life journey that you might find there in his travel home. All right. Like I said, I do encourage you to think on question 12 a little bit in your own life. As always, if you would have any comments, questions, or anything that I could help you with, I'm glad to talk with you, text with you, whatever. But know that we're always available. And we appreciate your attendance, your comments tonight. Let's stand together. We'll be dismissed in a word of prayer this evening. Brother Mike Ogden, would you care to close us in prayer? Amen. Y'all have a wonderful week. Rest of the week.